Story 1. Matching with a beautiful woman on Tinder who lured me to a dark remote field where an armed ambush awaited. Story 2. Forced onto the night delivery shift and attacked by a creepy customer who turned out to be a violent predator. Story 3. Receiving obsessive sexual letters at work and discovering the socially awkward customer wrote them and had murdered his own mother. I was 21 years old, a brand new police officer, and fresh out of a painful breakup. Following a friend's advice, I downloaded Tinder to distract myself. Being young, naive, and wearing a badge for the first time, I unfortunately possessed that toxic, indestructible, I can take on anyone mentality. Keep that foolish arrogance in mind as this nightmare unfolds. I ended up matching with a stunning woman who was, frankly, entirely out of my league. We hit it off over a few days of messaging, and when we finally agreed to meet, she suggested we skip the standard dinner and drinks. Instead, she wanted me to pick her up at her place, mentioning she had access to a massive private open field nearby, where we could hang out in the bed of my truck and look at the stars. When the night arrived, I picked her up. She was just as beautiful in person and seemed incredibly eager to get out to the property. Following her directions, we drove deep into the pitch-black countryside until we reached an expansive, overgrown field, bordered on all sides by a dense wall of dark woods. It was quiet, too quiet. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating a few deer scattering into the trees. But beyond that, the isolation was absolute. We parked and were just settling in when a faint glow appeared in my rearview mirror. Dim headlights were creeping toward us through the tall grass, moving at an agonizingly slow, deliberate pace. A dark, unmarked van pulled up directly in front of my truck, stopping just close enough to box me in. Every instinct I had honed at the academy twitched. I told my date to stay locked in the cab while I went to investigate. Grabbing my heavy-duty flashlight, I stepped out into the biting night air and cautiously approached the driver's side. A thickly built man was sitting behind the wheel, staring back at me. I shined my light near the floorboards, asked him what his business was, and politely requested he back his vehicle up. To my surprise, his demeanor was incredibly disarming. He offered a warm smile, claimed to be the owner of the property, and apologized for boxing us in. He explained that he'd been dealing with aggressive armed poachers lately and just wanted to ensure we weren't out there hunting illegally. I assured him we were just stargazing. He chuckled, cheerfully told us to enjoy our date, and slowly backed the van away, disappearing into the tree line. I got back into the truck, relieved but still on edge. For the next hour, the atmosphere was dead. My date, previously chatty and engaging, completely ignored me, her face illuminated only by the sickly glow of her phone screen as her thumbs flew across the keyboard in a non-stop barrage of text messages. An hour later, the headlights reappeared, but this time they weren't creeping. The van came tearing out of the woods, roaring toward us at a terrifying speed. "Get in," I yelled. We both jumped into my truck, and I slammed it into gear, violently maneuvering us into a defensive angle just as the van screeched to a halt, nearly tearing my front bumper off. Before I could even process the collision, the passenger door of my truck flew open. My date didn't scream. She didn't panic. She just hopped out and sprinted directly toward the van. In a sickening fraction of a second, the illusion shattered. I had been lured into a trap. I kicked my door open, yelling forceful, booming commands for them to back up and get on the dirt. Neither complied. The man exploded out of the van and charged me like a linebacker, slamming his entire body weight into my chest and tackling me hard into the cold dirt. The wind was knocked out of my lungs, but pure survival instinct took over. I managed to plant my knee, flip his heavy frame off of me, and scramble back to my feet. As I stood up, gasping for air, I saw my date reaching into the back of the van. She pulled out a thick, rusted metal pipe, her sweet demeanor entirely replaced by a feral, cornered look. She screamed that they had a gun, demanding my wallet, my keys, and my truck, promising I wouldn't end up dead if I just cooperated. Fueled by that stupid, blinding invincibility complex, I looked at the pipe, looked at the man, and flatly said, "No." Her tough facade instantly cracked. She burst into theatrical tears, hysterically insisting they didn't want to hurt me. As she wailed, the man began subtly shifting his weight, trying to close the distance back to his open van door. That's when I finally announced that I was a police officer. I drew my concealed firearm, leveled it at his chest, and roared for them to get on the ground. Absolute shock washed over their faces. The color drained from the girls' cheeks, and for a tense, breathless moment, they dropped to their knees in the dirt. I kept my sights locked on the man's center mass while frantically dialing dispatch with my free hand, calling in my badge number and screaming for emergency backup. But out in the middle of nowhere, giving cross streets is nearly impossible. While I was momentarily distracted trying to describe our remote location to the dispatcher, the two of them exchanged a desperate glance and bolted into the pitch-black woods. Acting like the reckless, adrenaline-drunk rookie I was, I abandoned my vehicle and gave chase. I sprinted into the suffocating darkness of the tree line, branches whipping my face, my flashlight bouncing wildly. I had pursued the man for maybe 30 seconds when the darkness in front of me suddenly erupted. Pop, pop, pop. 3 deafening gunshots echoed through the trees, accompanied by the blinding, unmistakable flash of a muzzle not 50 feet away from me. My invincibility complex evaporated into thin air. I hit the dirt, scrambled backward like a terrified animal, and sprinted back to my truck faster than I have ever run in my life. I threw it in drive and peeled out of that field, tires throwing a massive spray of dirt into the air. I fled back to the paved road where I had originally picked the girl up, my hands violently shaking against the steering wheel as I waited for the cavalry. Naturally, the first cruisers to arrive contained my sergeant and my field training officer. They took one look at me and unleashed absolute hell, tearing into me for abandoning cover and running blindly into an armed ambush. The words "dumbass" and "stupid rookie" were screamed at me repeatedly. Once the chewing out was over, I piled into the back of their cruiser and we led a convoy of officers back to the property. By some absolute miracle, the van was still parked exactly where they had left it. I was ordered to stay locked in the cruiser and keep my head down unless bullets started flying. The tactical team cleared the dark tree line and slowly descended on the abandoned vehicle. Right on the center console, they found a massive stash of crystal meth. But the drugs weren't what made my blood run cold. 10 minutes later, my sergeant and training officer walked back to the cruiser. The anger was gone from their faces, replaced by an eerie, pale horror. My sergeant opened my door, looked me dead in the eye, and quietly said, "You need to come look in the back of this van." I walked over, the flashing red and blue lights illuminating the interior of the cargo hold. Scattered across the ribbed metal floor was a literal serial killer's toolkit. Several massive hunting knives, heavy rolls of silver duct tape, bottles of lighter fluid, thick steel handcuffs, and a terrifying amount of high-caliber rifle ammunition. The floorboards were stained with what looked like dried blood. Resting casually in the front passenger seat was a fully loaded AR-15 style rifle and 2 stolen handguns. Detectives locked down the scene immediately. It later turned out the blood was theatrical fake blood, used to terrify their victims into submission, but the license plates and the van itself were reported stolen from a neighboring state. I still get physically nauseous when I close my eyes and picture that van pulling up in the dark. If I hadn't brought my gun, or if I had succumbed to their demands, I know exactly what those knives and duct tape would have been used for. Luckily, I walked away without a scratch, but it is incredibly safe to say my online dating days ended permanently that night. About 6 years ago, when I was 20, I worked as a delivery driver for a popular local pizzeria. Originally, I was assigned the late morning to mid-afternoon shift, which I genuinely enjoyed. But when our night shift driver got fired after losing his license to a DUI, I was forced to take over his hours. My boss had hired a family friend who supposedly couldn't work nights, so the dangerous burden fell entirely on me. I dreaded the late shift. You never really know what kind of unhinged intentions people harbor when they order food at 1 in the morning. But my boss gave me a cold ultimatum: take the night shift or get fired. Barely scraping by on rent, I couldn't afford to lose the job, so I reluctantly agreed. The first month went by smoothly enough. Then, I received a dispatch for a house sitting right on the absolute desolate edge of our delivery radius. It was around 11 p.m. when my GPS brought me to a quiet, decently lit suburban block filled with identical modern townhomes. The address belonged to a quiet duplex. I walked up to the porch, rang the doorbell, and waited. 30 seconds passed in total silence. I rang it again and waited another 30 seconds. A heavy, creeping anxiety started pooling in my stomach. The street was completely empty. Eventually, the deadbolt clicked, and the door slowly pulled open. A tall, unnervingly thin man in his late 40s stood in the doorway. I forced a retail smile and told him his total, but he didn't reach for his wallet. He just stood there, staring down at me with unblinking dead eyes in complete silence. The quiet stretched on for an uncomfortable amount of time. I nervously asked if he was okay. He finally blinked, shaking his head, muttering that he was just zoning out because he had just gotten off a long shift at work. Fair enough. He handed me a wad of cash. I handed him the warm boxes, and as I was looking down, counting his change, his voice suddenly dropped to a low, intimate whisper. "You are really beautiful, you know that." My skin crawled, but I tried not to read into it. I politely thanked him, shoved the change into his hand, and fast walked back to my car to finish my shift. A few days later, the printer spat out another order for the exact same address. I arrived around the same time, the neighborhood just as dead as before, and rang the bell. This time, he answered instantly, looking flushed and overly excited, as if he had been waiting right behind the wood. "Hey, it's you again. How are you?" he asked, his voice dripping with forced cheerfulness. I was exhausted and made a passing comment about how I couldn't wait to just go home and sleep. He chuckled knowingly while slowly pulling out his wallet. As he meticulously counted his bills, drawing out the interaction, he casually asked for my name. Too tired to think defensively, I gave it to him. The moment I handed him his change, he leaned in, blocking the doorway with his frame, and asked for my phone number, saying he'd love to hang out with someone as gorgeous as me. Every red flag in my body shot up. I had only met this guy twice, just bringing him pizza. Furthermore, I looked notoriously young for my age. People constantly assumed I was a high school sophomore. I took a step back, awkwardly mumbled that I had a boyfriend, and looked away. His warm demeanor instantly vanished, replaced by a chilling, deadpan glare. "Oh, okay, I see," he replied, his voice suddenly devoid of all warmth. We stood in a tense, suffocating silence until I muttered a quick goodnight and practically sprinted back to my car. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced in my rearview mirror. He hadn't gone inside. He was just standing on the edge of his porch in the dark, staring intensely at my taillights until I turned the corner. When I got back to the shop, I mentioned the deeply unsettling encounter to my co-workers, who all agreed he sounded like a creep. My boss, however, overheard the conversation and coldly accused me of making up exaggerated stories just to get out of the night shift. A week later, another order came in for the same guy. That's when the nightmare truly escalated. I pulled up to the duplex at 10:30 p.m. The entire property was pitch black. Not a single porch light or living room lamp was on. Gripping the warm pizza box like a shield, I nervously walked up the driveway. Before my foot even hit the first step of the porch, the front door violently swung open. The man was standing in the dark foyer, but he wasn't wearing his casual clothes anymore. He was dressed completely in a tailored formal suit. I physically jumped backward, my heart hammering against my ribs. He let out a dark, booming laugh, claiming he had watched me pull up from the living room window and wanted to save me the trouble of knocking. A wave of pure terror washed over me. Why was he sitting alone in the pitch dark, fully suited, watching the street? I let out a shaky, nervous laugh, trying to keep things professional. He stepped out onto the porch, asking if I liked his suit. I politely nodded, avoiding eye contact. Then, he bluntly asked if I wanted to abandon my shift and go on a date with him right that second. Panicking, I backed down a step and repeated firmly that I had a boyfriend. He chuckled darkly, stepping uncomfortably close, towering over me. "Honey, there's no way a girl your age is in a serious relationship," he whispered, his breath hot against my face. "Come inside. I'll show you how a real man treats a girl." Before I could even process the threat, his arm shot out. He violently snatched the pizza box from my hands, chucked it into the dark yard, and grabbed both of my arms with a bone-crushing grip. I was utterly petrified, fighting back hot tears, pleading with him to just let me go back to my car. He stared down at me with the most sinister, predatory expression I have ever seen and growled, "I don't care. Get inside now. We are going to have a good time." He violently jerked his entire body weight backward, trying to drag me through the open doorway into the blackness of his home. I dug my heels into the concrete and fought back with every ounce of strength I had. During the chaotic struggle, he let go of my left arm to reach deep into his suit pocket, pulling out the glinting metallic handle of a heavy folding knife. Running on pure, blinding adrenaline, I used my newly freed arm, balled my fist and punched him directly in the stomach as hard as humanly possible. The visceral blow knocked the wind out of him, stunning him just long enough for his crushing grip on my right arm to loosen. I ripped myself free and sprinted for my car, screaming for help. I practically dove into the driver's seat, but before I could slam the door shut, he lunged into the opening. He grabbed my shirt, trying to rip me out of the vehicle while wielding the open blade in his other hand. He was screaming guttural curses at me for making things difficult, his face twisted in pure rage. Trapped against the steering wheel, I grabbed a heavy, half-empty glass soda bottle from my cup holder and blindly chucked it directly at his face. The thick glass connected with the bridge of his nose with a sickening crack. He recoiled in pain, his hands flying to his face, giving me just enough time to slam the heavy car door and hit the lock button. Enraged and bleeding, he completely lost his mind. He leaped entirely onto the hood of my car, frantically scratching and violently stabbing his blade into my windshield, screaming at the top of his lungs for me to turn the car off. I threw the transmission into reverse and floored the gas pedal. The tires shrieked as I tore backward down the suburban street, the madman desperately clinging to my windshield wipers, his eyes wide with psychotic fury. I aggressively slammed the brakes and cranked the steering wheel, swerving onto the nearest cross street. The violent momentum finally ripped his grip loose, and he was thrown off the slick hood, tumbling hard onto the pavement. I slammed the car into drive and floored it. I didn't look back. I took random, frantic turns through the neighborhood for miles, utterly terrified that his headlights might appear in my rearview mirror. Eventually, I hit a red light on a main road and slammed on the brakes, sitting frozen in the dead, empty intersection. The adrenaline suddenly crashed, and the horrifying realization of how close I had just come to being dragged into a pitch-black house with a knife hit me all at once. I collapsed over the steering wheel, shaking violently and sobbing uncontrollably. When I finally made it back to the pizzeria, I must have looked like a ghost. The moment I walked through the doors, my co-worker dropped a stack of boxes and rushed over. I broke down crying as I hyperventilated through the story of the attack. My boss, suddenly realizing how horribly wrong he had been, turned completely pale and apologized profusely for forcing me onto the shift. He brought me into the back office, locked the door, and called 911. The police arrived quickly. The officers took my official statement, photographed the dark, hand-shaped bruises already forming on my arms, and documented the terrifying web of deep knife scratches all over my car's hood and shattered windshield. I handed in my uniform and quit my job the very next day. 2 agonizing days later, the lead detective called me with a chilling update. The duplex was legally owned by the man's brother, who lived on the right side. My attacker lived on the left. It turned out he possessed a massive, horrific criminal record. He had started his career with armed robbery and aggravated assault, eventually graduating to severe, violent sex crimes. He had just been released from state prison a mere 5 months prior, after serving a sentence for sexually assaulting a minor. When a heavily armed SWAT team raided the duplex hours after my attack, the house was completely empty. He had vanished. I spent the next 2 months living in absolute suffocating terror. Every shadow looked like him. Every car driving slowly past my apartment made my heart stop. I was convinced he was going to track me down to finish what he started. But eventually, the police contacted me again to close the loop. He had fled to a neighboring city, where his dark compulsions caught up with him. He had attempted to kidnap a teenage girl walking alone at night, trying to drag her into a stolen car. Fortunately, a watchful neighbor saw the violent struggle from their second-story window and immediately dialed 911. Police cruisers swarmed the area and caught him right as he was trying to shove the screaming girl into the trunk. He dropped her, jumped into the driver's seat, and fled the scene, initiating a massive high-speed pursuit. A few miles down the road, he blew through a solid red light on a busy commercial boulevard at 80 miles an hour. He was instantly T-boned on the driver's side by a massive commercial delivery van. The van's driver walked away with minor bumps and bruises, but my attacker was crushed inside the mangled steel of his stolen car. He died instantly, long before the sirens of the ambulance even reached the intersection. Walking out of the police station into the cool night air after hearing the news, I lit a cigarette and took a long, deep breath. I don't usually wish death upon anyone, but standing there under the streetlights, all I felt was a profound, overwhelming sense of relief. When I was 19, I packed up my entire life in Oregon and moved down to Florida to live with my boyfriend. I was young and naive, picturing a paradise of endless white sand beaches and weekend trips to Disney World. Instead, reality gave me suffocating swamp humidity, massive prehistoric-looking bugs, and miles of desolate dirt roads. We settled in a tiny, forgotten town called Hawthorne, nestled in the dense woods just outside of Gainesville. It was the kind of claustrophobic place with exactly one stoplight and maybe 4 businesses to its name. A rundown Dollar General, a local market, a greasy barbecue joint, and an Eckerd pharmacy. To help pay the bills, I managed to get a job working the cash register at the Eckerd. Because it sat right in the middle of town next to the only grocery store, it served as the community hub, meaning virtually everyone in the area shopped there. About 3 months into the job, I walked through the sliding glass doors to start my shift and was immediately intercepted by my manager. He looked incredibly pale and pulled me straight into his cramped back office, locking the door behind us. Laid out across his messy desk, covering almost every inch of space, was somewhere between 30 and 40 handwritten letters. Every single one of them was addressed to me. "Do you know this person?" my manager asked, his voice dead serious. I shook my head, entirely confused. He nudged one of the open letters toward me, a cheerful, bright yellow envelope, and instructed me to read it. Inside were 2 heavily scribbled notebook pages folded around a glossy magazine cutout of a woman with long, golden blonde hair, styled exactly like mine. As my eyes scanned the frantic handwriting, my confusion quickly warped into pure, sickening terror. The letters were utterly chaotic, detailing deeply disturbing, highly violent sexual fantasies about what spending time alone with me would be like. There were intensely specific, skin-crawling comments about watching me from afar, washing my hair, smelling my skin, and watching me sleep in the moonlight. Certain terrifying sentences were obsessively highlighted in neon marker and underlined so hard the pen had ripped the paper. My first panic thought was that my manager thought I was somehow involved and was about to fire me. "Do you know this guy? David?" my manager pressed, pointing to the scrawled signature at the bottom. The name clicked instantly, and a cold dread pooled in my stomach. David was a towering, incredibly lanky man in his late 20s who frequented the store. He had thick, smudged glasses, frizzy, dark blonde hair, and always wore the same stained clothes. He came in a few times a week to buy 2-liter bottles of Diet Coke and pick up heavy psychiatric medications for his mother. It was painfully obvious he was socially or mentally challenged. On rare occasions, he tried to force awkward small talk while I rang him up. Or worse, he would linger uncomfortably near the end of my register lane, just staring at me with a blank, unblinking expression. I had always chalked it up to poor social cues and considered him completely harmless. But as I stood in the suffocating office, staring at the psychotic manifesto laid out on the desk, a strange, brief encounter from 2 weeks prior suddenly clicked into horrifying focus. I had been kneeling on the floor, organizing the bottom shelves of the shampoo aisle, when David had walked up completely silently behind me. Without a word, he had reached out and gently stroked his fingers through my hair. Startled, I had physically jerked away, pulling my hair out of his clammy hands. He had just mumbled an awkward apology and shuffled away. I had thought it was just the bizarre behavior of a socially inept townie. Nothing malicious. After I breathlessly shared this detail with my manager, he informed me that David was being permanently banned from the premises. He told me to clock out, go home immediately, lock my doors, and wait while they worked out the details with the local authorities. I walked out of the store in a total daze, constantly checking my rearview mirror as I drove the dirt roads back to my boyfriend's house. 2 hours later, a heavy, authoritative knock rattled my front door. I peeked through the blinds and almost stopped breathing. It looked like a militarized zone on my front lawn. A full SWAT team had descended on our quiet street. There were massive men geared up in heavy green tactical vests holding assault rifles, 2 plainclothes detectives flashing badges, and several uniformed local officers securing the perimeter. I shakily opened the door, and a female officer stepped forward, holding up a thick stack of the familiar, colorful envelopes. "Ma'am, can we come inside and talk to you about these?" she asked gently. Mortified that the entire county police force was reading these vile, sexually explicit letters, I stepped aside and let them in. We sat on the living room couch while my boyfriend stood defensively in the hallway, glaring at me as if I had somehow invited this madness. The officer leaned forward and explained that the moment the department received the trespassing notice from the Eckerd manager, every cop in the precinct recognized David's name immediately. They had driven straight to David's dilapidated house in the woods to serve him the ban in person. David did not handle the rejection well. He had spent 45 minutes screaming frantically at the officers, insisting that it was a massive conspiracy, that I was deeply in love with him, and that I was waiting for him to come take me away. Because he became incredibly combative and physically aggressive, the police forcefully detained him and decided to pursue heavy, formal stalking charges. "You need to be completely aware of his history," the female officer told me, her expression turning grim. When David was 12 years old, he murdered and partially dismembered his own mother. My stomach completely dropped. The room started to spin. She went on to explain, in horrifying detail, that he had been locked away in a high-security juvenile psychiatric facility for over a decade. Due to legal loopholes regarding his age at the time of the brutal murder, he had been quietly released back into society less than 4 years ago. During their visit to his house today, while securing the premises, officers had discovered a highly disturbing shrine of materials confirming that he had been heavily stalking me outside of work hours. He knew exactly where I lived. He knew my car. He knew my schedule. David was arrested the very next morning after a patrol car found him pacing the Eckerd parking lot in the pitch black, waiting in the bushes by my designated parking spot. The last I heard, the judge deemed him an immediate threat to the public, and he was sent back to a state psychiatric hospital indefinitely. I never found out exactly what horrific photographs or trophies the police uncovered in his bedroom, and I pray I never do. My boyfriend ended up being completely unsupportive, blaming me for leading him on by simply doing my customer service job. I realized I was entirely alone in a nightmare. A week later, I packed everything I owned into my car, left the boyfriend behind, and drove back to the safety of Oregon. Let's just say I wasn't sticking around a sweltering swamp town, where the local Norman Bates had meticulously chosen me to be his next victim.